Okay, well, welcome to Developers Let's Play of Defender's Quest. I'm Lars I'm kind of lead developer, do most of the programming and stuff, and some of the design kind of guy. And this is...
I am James Cavan. I am the lead writer/writer. I don't really have anyone working under me.
Yeah, we call him the USDA Certified English Major because the Department of Agriculture is certifying those things now. Anyway, so we just thought we'd do like a little developer's commentary of the game, and we're just going to play through it here. So here we're just going to start a new save here, and as we go through this game, we're just going to talk about all the decisions we made and stuff. And so what do you want to do? Just start a game here?
I think we should go back and just admire Karen's artwork, the front page, for a moment.
Yeah, it's pretty awesome.
Bask in its glory.
Yeah, I think it's pretty awesome. I mean, this is... we had an original version of the game, which we released in January, which had art that was mostly done by me, and therefore was bad. And this is artist Karen Petrasco. We got her to do this big, sexy kind of facelift for the whole game, and so she did like the new logo, and she did like all this art and stuff. And so we feel that like made things a lot better, because like early on people were like, oh, it looks good, but like I don't like the art, and the game's fun, but get some better art, so
That's what we did.
time well spent. So here's the ubiquitous save slot screen. Now here's a feature that's coming soon. It's not in late, but you'll be able to play the game in multiple languages. Right now you have your choice of English or English, and that's all it does. This is where you can play a mod for Defender's Quest. You know, we have mods available. You can create a new one or load one, and that works pretty well. Then we got a bunch of fancy options, but we'll just get into the game here now. So we'll start a new game. Should we go with the standard names or pick new ones?
I'm partial to standard names, but that's because I created them all.
Well,
so.
if you're the writer here, we'll stick with that because that's what you would call them anyway. And so how did we wind up with Azra as our main character? You want to talk about that a little bit?
Well, actually, there's some interesting stories behind the names. Azra is actually an Arabic name. We were generally trying to go with kind of a Mediterranean feel for Azra and her whole civilization. But there's a lot of different names in there that have actual some significant meaning behind them. For instance, Zalamir, who's kind of our bad guy, his name is Old Slavic, and it literally translates to desire for peace. And actually, I'm going to geek out here for a moment on language. Because in Russian, the word for peace is a homonym of the word for the world. It's mir. So that name can mean both desire for peace and desire for the world, which I thought was really cool, and I haven't actually been able to tell anyone about until now.
That's pretty cool. I mean, I'm not nearly as educated as James on that kind of stuff, so like, all I know is that you Google Azra and you get a bunch of Iranian supermodels in Google image search.
Yep.
Cool, so let's talk a little bit about our cutscene design here. One of the things we really wanted to do in this game, and that James kind of reinforced for me as a writer, is I hate long, lengthy intro cutscenes. So one thing we wanted to do is get you into the game as quickly as possible. And so we kind of like hit you first with like some really nice, sexy cutscene art, you know, just get everything to it. And it took us a while to like really refine this opening cutscene. Should I just click through it, James, and do you want to talk about it?
Go for it.
So yeah, obviously there's not much to see here. We know who the protagonist's name is. And we can tell it, you know, she's dying. And just this whole thing just started with James doing a couple storyboards, and we had Karen do the art later. And the whole point is just to communicate as much as possible about the initial situation right from the start, and then bam, you can interact with something. So we're about to jump into another cutscene here pretty soon, you know, as soon as you open this battle and start it, but I wanted the player to be clicking on something within 10 seconds of playing the game. So even though there's two cutscenes like right one after another, the time to click is short, and I felt that was important. What do you think about that, James?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember, when we first started out, our goal was to have no more than 5 clicks before each mission. So actually, if you go back, you'll see some cutscenes that still do that I didn't have time to rewrite.
Yeah, and then we found out that like people actually were like a lot of people didn't actually mind the longer cutscenes. So we started off really conservative there, and then we started to bloat it up a little once we felt people were willing to get engaged in the story. So you have a lot longer scenes later, but early on they're all pretty short. And so one of the hardest things actually, so the halfway world, one of the hardest things for us to explain early on was the entire premise of the game and the battle system. And would now be a good time to talk about why we picked the halfway world and the pit and everything.
Well, let's let him see the first mission.
Yeah, okay.
Introduced to it.
So yeah, we start each act here with one of these little proverbs or little quote sayings that you would find on a Magic the Gathering card.
Yeah, that's something that I yanked directly out of Thief the Dark Project.
Oh, cool. Yeah, I didn't know that until just now. Cool. So we start off here. Scare music. So our characters has no idea what's going on, and so this is where we kind of introduce one of the forces behind the game.
I'm still disappointed in my art for that character on the right. I think that will always bother me.
Yeah, actually, James here actually filled in and did the art for us for our characters here. The backgrounds are obviously by Karen, but we just, James volunteered to do this art here, and so I think it looks pretty good. I added these little light layers in Gold Edition. You know, obviously neither James or I are professional artists, but, you know, we did what we could with what we had, and I think it turns out pretty good. And of course, this is actually a little thing about this little secret language font that that the big bad uses and that you see in other places is, it's a font called Glagolitsa, and it's actually the Glagolithic alphabet, which, a little known fact, a lot of people know that Russian and Slavic languages use the Cyrillic alphabet, which was brought by Saint Cyril and Methodius in, what century? I don't know, a long time ago. He's kind of the one who brought them their alphabet. But there was another alphabet that I know very little about. I'm not sure how popular it was, and that's called the Glagolithic alphabet. So most of the Slavs didn't have a written language, but those that did, it kind of looked like this. And so I kind of thought that would be cool. Something besides just using, like, runes, which are kind of overused. And you can actually, one thing I wanted in cutscenes, actually, was I wanted them all to be perfectly skippable. I wanted them to be rewatchable from a menu at any time, and I wanted you to be able to go back. Because I always hate it when you miss something in cutscenes, and that happens so often in RPGs. I just remember I was playing Shadow of the Colossus with my best friend Sean over at his house, and there's this playable ending, and I don't want to spoil it, but there's this scene during the ending where you can, like, play and interact with it. And I thought there was, like, something, like, important for me to accomplish, and, like, if I didn't do it right, I would get a bad ending or something. That turned out not to be true, but I didn't know that at the time. And just as we're in the middle of this thing, and you can't pause at all, his little cousin comes over and spills yogurt, like, all over our controllers and stuff. It's like, that would have been a really nice time to pause, or know that I could go back and get that cutscene without having to, like, fight the whole battle all over again, and you can't do that, and I hate it. So, that whole segue was because I wanted to click back here and talk about this just real quick. So, we actually had people start deciphering this text, and
within like 5 minutes of starting the beta.
It was really interesting. Like, within the beta, like, we had like several people decode this text and like all the little secrets in the game, which there's a lot of, within like 5 minutes of launching it. But since then, since the Gold Edition, since the Steam launch, we haven't had a single email like that. So I guess we need to put some incentives in the game to get people to look at the secrets. This is when Azra discovers her magical powers and her new friend Slack. Cool. So here we have the battle interface. And likewise, we spent like so much time on these first two battles. Like, it was just an enormous amount of time getting the first two battles to play right, because I use Steve Krug's philosophy of usability design, which he outlines a book called Don't Make Me Think. And his philosophy is basically like this. If you want to make something good, he always talks about websites, but I apply it to games. If you want to make something good, you find some person who hasn't used it yet, you plonk them down in front of it with no instructions, and then you do not help them at all when they try and struggle to figure out how to use it. And you just watch them try and use it, and you ask them to just tell you what they're thinking, and then maybe you give them a couple tasks to do. But you don't give them any help, you don't give them any hints, you resist that urge, and you just watch them struggle with your horrible software. And then what's really crazy about it is you don't have to, like, crunch data. It just becomes obvious what all the problems are. So I can't tell you, like, how many of James's friends I kidnapped and had them play the first couple levels of Defender's Quest until they could just figure out everything what they were supposed to be doing. And that's where we get these tutorials from. And so, you know, she starts off wondering where she is, and we point out So, first of all, we point out where the character is, because sometimes people didn't notice where the character was. So that's also why we make the character glow and have this glowy outline, and have this visible crater that anchors her position and differentiates her from other characters. The other problem is I would put this game in front of people, and the first thing they would try to do is move Azra with the arrow keys.
Yep.
Which is why we say, Azra can't move. You know, and then we point out where the enemies are coming from, because the first thing people do when they see enemies coming is freaking out, not knowing if they're going to come from anywhere, so we had to make that explicit. And also point out what the goal was. I mean, tower defense players get this right along, but since this is a hybrid, RPG players don't necessarily know what they're in for. And then we introduce the summoning mechanic. And because, you know, you're eventually going to have a huge party, they're nested in little menus. So we needed to show how to use these things early on when you only have one dude. And what we found... James, you want to talk about this a little
bit? We actually didn't introduce that. Like, originally, the first level just had the only thing you could do is use your lightning spell.
Right.
And so we found that that just started people off on the completely wrong foot, because the very first lesson you learn is, oh, I use lightning all the time. That is the main mode of the game, when it's not at all. So we actually, we had that for a long time, and we finally went back and just rewrote it so that we could introduce summoning a character right at the get-go.
Right, this was supposed to be the second level, actually. And so it seemed easier to us from a story standpoint to, like, introduce monsters and then give you some cheap way to kill them without having to put another character in, because that's a lot of front-loading of stuff. We had to, like, it took us a long time to figure out how to put Slack in there really quickly. But when we were just giving people lightning first, the first thing you show a player how to do is the thing they're going to use forever.
Yeah.
And lightning is not an optimal tactic. You only use it when enemies leak by. So we had to redesign the second level so that you get lightning only to deal with enemies that are absolutely going to leak. And we set it up so that there's no way to avoid that. So anyways, here we're introducing Slack first. You know, and so it shows all the berserkers and stuff. Oh, another thing in the early tutorial, we would have this little bouncy arrow pointing at things, and I was just used to always, like a good little boy, closing the tutorial menu and then clicking on the thing it's pointing to. But a lot of people would immediately try to click here and it wouldn't respond to them at all, and they'd get frustrated and they wouldn't know what to do. So I put in a special little code in the tutorial to put up a hotspot on whatever it's pointing to, so you can click through it and it'll automatically work. And that was a little bit of extra effort that was totally worth it. So here she's, you know, getting Slack going. And after this, we'll explain the whole story behind the halfway world in a second here. So, And then, you know, we want to show people... Like, what's interesting is that tower defense players understand that peninsulas is where you put the crowd control guys. But what's so interesting is watching a lot of Let's Plays or just seeing friends play. Like, a lot of first-time players don't know that, especially if they're not familiar with the genre. So we tried to, like, early on, give a couple hints about basic strategy, like put the crowd control guys on the peninsula, because that means that there's more surface area and more time for them to hit things. So we do that. And then we show PSI here. You know, early on people weren't, you know, a lot of early testers weren't understanding how the PSI mechanic worked. I mean, obviously tower defense players always get this stuff, but we were worried about the new people. So we just wanted to make sure that got through. And then there's actually a lot of things you have to, like, teach people in this. When you just say it all out, it's a lot to hear. So one thing is that people didn't know that the defenders would automatically attack. So we spell that out for those who don't know that. And then we also introduce the time controls, because that's very important. So we've communicated that you can pause the game and that you can change the speed at any time like that. And players hopefully can figure out this little bar eventually, but we'll point out things about that later. So here are the guys, you can click on them. So I'm going to pause right now. And look at this little enemy menu. One thing I really wanted to do in this game is that there's a lot of information in this game. I mean, look at all these stats and all this interface and stuff. And this is as, like, minimal as we could make it and still have the depth we wanted. And so what I tried to do is just remove text wherever I could, but I don't want to hide information from the player. So I'm kind of the tooltip king. I put tooltips on everything. And these are the kind of, like, instant tooltips, not like the ones where you, like, hover over it and do a rain dance and hope Photoshop will show you what the button is. And then, you know, stuff like that. So you can click on any enemy and get detailed information about it, both up here and over here. You can see how many health it has. You can see what stats it has. And for stats, I just only show stats that are basically relevant. So like, you know, enemies don't have like a dodge or like a defense stat.
Concupiscence.
Yeah, exactly. Or like, you know, I just tried to make all the stats just like directly relevant things. So this thing is a little sack of hit points that moves half as slow as some other things. And when it hits Azra, it does 2 damage, and that's all you need to know about it. And so, unpause here, and Slack gets to it. Okay, and there's bouncy white numbers, because it's not
an RPG.
Yeah, it's not an RPG if there's not bouncy white numbers. But you can turn those off, obviously. Especially because on ridiculous levels, there's just so much craziness. Now, the next thing we need to introduce is the boosting mechanic. And this is, you know, upgrading stuff is pretty common in tower defense, but boosting does something really specific in Defender's Quest, and it's kind of novel, and so we can't even rely on the standard tower defense people to understand exactly what it's doing. So what we do here is that we have this boost bar that you can fill up, and it's tied to their active attacks, which is very important, and that's why there's 2 arrows here. And so we actually had to start Slack with both of his initial attacks so that we could introduce this right from the beginning. And so, so now that this second attack is unlocked, he's actually doing 2 different attacks, and you can see them cool down here and see all of their stats. And that's what makes that's just the whole core of the mini game of the battles, plus the meta game of what skills you want to get, is having boosts tied to that. And do you remember, like, was there any trouble with like people getting that early on, or whatever, or do you think they just figured it out?
I think in general, like, once you point it out to someone, I feel like "you won't regret it" is a good phrase to use in a tutorial.
Yeah, exactly. And so you just want to show people, like, by showing people that summoning and boosting guys is, like, what you need to do. I think if you don't boost him to level 3, a monster might leak. If you don't boost him at all, I think a monster might leak and you might lose. But, yeah, and this is the reward screen. It took us a while to make, but it's signaling to you a couple of things, you know? It's signaling how well you did and why you did well, you know? So you can interpret from this that if Azra gets hit, you'll still probably win, but you won't get, you know, perfect. And then here you can see that you're probably going to get up to 5 more Berserkers soon and probably 6 classes total. And this is the whole XP bar and stuff. And so you can already go seamlessly from the reward screen to the party screen. I thought that was very important because I wanted to reduce the amount of menus you had to click through to go to stuff, because I hate RPGs where everything is stacked in like 10 different menus. So I wanted it so that you never had to go deeper than like 1 or 2 sub-menus at most.
I can't tell you how many games I've played where I have to just draw myself a map on how to get to what I want.
Right. And yeah. So like you can, like, if you had points available to spend, you could go here and you could start upgrading Slack immediately. You could go equip him right from here. You know, you could change his name if you wanted, and all of those things just right from the get-go. And I just thought that was important. Now they have their first conversation. Go for it.
One of the things I really wanted to avoid with pretty much any game is I wanted to minimize front-loaded exposition, because it drives me crazy when I start up a game and it just goes, okay, now sit still for 5 minutes while we scroll through this text dump that's essentially the opening to my Tolkien knockoff. And it just I don't need to know the entire history of this made-up place before I start playing. So I wanted to start out and land the player on their feet and immediately line up the player's motivation and the character's motivation. Because that's a huge pet peeve of mine, is I feel like the player should always have the same motivation as the character.
And they don't always. Usually the character cares about something and the player just wants to, like, kill stuff or whatever. Which is why you have, like, the world ends tomorrow! It's like, hang on, I'm like, I need to check out all the carnival rides.
There are shiny things to collect.
Right, it's like, I'm gonna save the people, but the people are full of treasure. You know, so anyway.
So yeah, my goal here was I wanted to have that first cutscene, dump you into the first mission, and you and Azra's motivations are both, I don't want to get eaten by monsters, and I want to figure out what's going on.
Right.
And you don't need to know the complex geopolitical background for that to happen. That's there. You can find it out throughout the course of your adventure. But for both the character and the player, it is significantly secondary to the immediate tasks at hand, which are don't get eaten and figure out what's going on.
Right, and now that you've had one level, I think this cutscene is where you start telling people a little bit about what's going on. So we've seen that there's this big, scary, fiery monster guy, and I was dying from a plague, and I got chucked into a pit. And now we're going to get a little bit of explanation now that we've had a little bit of time to play. Yeah, I feel like the player's a little more patient now, and so Slack's motivation here gets explained pretty quickly.
It wouldn't even fit on him.
Yeah, but Slack is kind of a nice character for these sort of things because he takes everything in stride, and he's also kind of insane.
Yeah, that was the thing, is we needed a character, when we needed to introduce summoning in the first mission, we were like, well, we need a character that can be dropped in and not waste time with exposition. So we got Slack because he doesn't care.
And he's also probably, mentally ill. So yeah. So we explained that basically Azra was dying of the plague and survived, and we implied later that she's immune, because this was important. In the early game, Azra has the plague, and now she's alive, and she's like adventuring. Like what happened?
Yeah, we had her. I'm trying to remember. First write-up, she was going to be dying the entire time.
Right, exactly. And then we explain, the setting, the pit. And yeah, now here we explicitly say she's immune to the plague. So people are like, oh, okay, so she had the plague, she survived, now she's immune, just like people who survive, I don't know, like...
Chickenpox.
Polio, does that work?
I'm not sure.
Well, it works with some diseases, and it works with this one, which is completely unspecified. And then, she's hopeful, and then a lot of times whenever a character asks this, it's basically because the audience is asking it. And we're answering that question for the audience. It's like, okay, I'm cured, so I can leave, right? And then it's like, well, obviously you don't live in a pessimistic, cynical medieval culture. And so in here is where we name drop, the initial civilization. So we mentioned that there is an Ash Kingdom, and that's where you're from. But we're not like, the Ash Kingdom in the year 2074 RX was dying from a plague, and the Count Vizier of the Lower Chancellor was the House of Parliament. Nobody cares. So, and then we started talking a little bit about the halfway world. We'll get to that in a second. And then we also have just a normal character would have as many questions for Azra as Azra has for him. Like, well, what just happened? What is your magical power? Where did you just take me? What is going on? And we wanted to avoid that because Azra kind of is the eyes of the player, and we want to answer the player's question. We don't want to waste time answering someone else's. And so that's why we have Slack, who just like, water off a duck's back. He's crazy. He doesn't think it's a big deal. He's just, excited he got to kill some stuff.
He was a great character for very one-sided conversations, where it's like, okay, we're just going to bounce questions off Slack.
While he sits there and flexes his oiled muscles. And so he just writes the whole thing off as a hallucination, some sort of bad trip, which apparently he's had many of. And then Azra, as the voice of reason, is like, you and I can't share the same dream. And then he gets distracted by something shiny, just in time to not answer the question. And then this is kind of direct, this screen is kind of directly inspired by Final Fantasy VI, where you have the new character and it gives you a little blurb about them and your chance to name them. And our awesome little sprites done by our great sprite artist, Yvonne. We should plug all our contractors while we're doing this. So obviously the music that you're hearing, we have it turned off so we can record a separate audio channel, but you should be able to hear it. That music's done by Kevin Penkin, who is our amazing,
phenomenal,
super great musician. Oh, and we should also plug those who cannot be with us today. Anthony Pecorella is actually the lead designer of the game, and he's not here today because he doesn't live in this state. But yeah. So give Slack a name, and now we're dumped back onto the overworld. And now, before we start this mission, I'm going to end this video here real quick.